Welcome to this grab bag on scaffolding questions. In this grab bag, I'm going to talk about how to be flexible in your questioning so that all students can participate, experience success, and crucially, build a classroom culture where your students are thinking hard about their learning. So one of Rosenshine's principles of instruction is that effective teachers ask lots of questions. And he said this: so we want to be asking effective questions, questions that require as many of our students as possible to be thinking hard for as long as possible in our lessons. So here's something to consider that might help with that. Why should you try to scaffold questions? And I'll explain how to do it in a moment, but scaffolding questions is a really good way of ensuring that students can't opt out of answering, and so they can't just decide to be classroom passengers. So when we're asking questions to the class, we want to avoid that teacher versus student game of chicken to see who gives in first. If you always default to just telling them the answer, they'll get into the habit of just waiting it out. So essentially, they need to realise that if they say they don't know, they should expect a follow-up question until you find something they do know. That will then help them or someone else in the class to answer your first question. So doing it this way means that it gives everyone the chance to succeed. If the first question is pitched a little too hard for them at that moment, you can adapt quickly to providing another question that they can answer. You then get the opportunity to praise them in public, which is a good way of building positive teacher-student relationships. It also helps activate relevant prior knowledge, making explicit the links between their existing learning and then leveraging it to come up with answers about the new learning. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. Then also, after a while, students start to realise they're going to have to answer questions in your classroom, and that it's not possible just to be a passenger. And this can have a really big impact on the overall learning culture. You thank them for answering regardless of whether their answer is right or wrong, and then once you do find a correct response, you praise them for getting the question right and show then how their answer helps with the next answer. So how are we actually going to do it? What might it look like in your classroom? And this is going to be a little bit subject specific, so you'll have to take the principle and apply it to your own subject. But first of all, and crucially, don't accept "I don't know" as a final answer. Instead, find another question that's conceptually underneath the first question and scaffold to enable the student to respond. Find something that they can respond to. So I suggest thinking of it as a kind of a scaffold or a ladder where each level or rung needs to be climbed on to get to the next one, and this really requires good pedagogical content knowledge. Well, here's an example. I might ask, what is the function of the left ventricle? And if the student doesn't know, you can ask them, why does the left ventricle have a thicker wall? Because this question will prompt some of the prior knowledge required to answer the first question. And you can keep going with this, of course. The next question might be, what is the ventricle wall made from? And I'm hoping they'll say, oh, it's made of muscle. And then that should help them to realise that the thicker the muscle, the stronger the contraction. And that will help them to explain why the left ventricle has a thicker wall, because it needs that stronger contraction, and so on. And you know, we could go even deeper. We could go all the way down to sort of, why is the heart made of muscle? So once you get to the correct answer, what you've done is activated a relevant piece of prior knowledge, and then you now see if you can help the student work their way back up to answer the original question. There is another option at this point. We can also bounce to another student, and this will keep the rest of the class on their toes, because we don't want to spend too much time focused on one student while the rest of the class goes to sleep. So this can keep the class on their toes. You might say, okay, how does the answer we've just heard help us answer the question I asked before, and then pick a different student to respond. And then over time, your students will learn that you expect them to be listening to one another's answers because they might be asked next. So a word of warning, if it's clear that they don't know and they aren't going to be able to work it out with their prior knowledge, then you'll obviously have to make a judgment call about how long to wait for them and how far down that scaffold you're willing to go. You certainly don't want to embarrass your students, but at the same time, don't let them off the hook too easily. They need to think hard if they're going to remember what you've taught them. Here's one more example. This time this is from geography. So how can urban flood risk be reduced? If they can't answer this, you could follow it up with, well, why does urbanisation increase flood risk? To get them to think about the features of urbanisation that might help answer the first question. If that doesn't help them, you could try, well, how does concrete affect infiltration? And then maybe if that doesn't work, you might ask, well, what is infiltration? And you can work your way back up by bouncing the questions around the group until everybody has worked their way to an answer for the first and original question. So hopefully you see the general principle and can think of how it might look in your subject. Now, the best way to get good at thinking of questions like this is by building your pedagogical content knowledge, as we've already said, because it relies upon that deep understanding of your subject and how it fits together. And you can do that over time and in conversation with other experienced teachers of your subject. And if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy or Solo taxonomy, these might help as well design some follow-up questions. You might even want to plan the questions in advance, and that will depend on how proficient you are with the topic you're teaching. And of course, you can combine this with other strategies, cold calling strategies like pose, pause, pounce, and that sort of thing, to ensure that if everyone knows they might be asked a question, they should then all be thinking about an answer. And it's that thinking that we're trying to achieve. And this is just one more strategy to that end. So here are a few places you can find more details on this idea. But that's it for this grab bag, and I'll see you in the next one.